Shalom, Most High in Christ bless. I'm Officer Razes with Israel United in Christ. And in this video, we'll be going over Black in Indonesia, taken and forsaken. Let's open up with this first article, Africans in Indonesia.
African Indonesian. African Indonesians refers to Indonesians of full or partial Bantu African ancestry. They may have been born in or immigrated to Indonesia.
So let's find out who are these Bantus that so-called migrated to Indonesia. Watch this.
The land of the heart of Livingstone, or the genius of the Bantu. It is allowed that groups of Israelitish people have from time to time journeyed into the Upper Nile country. The contention has been made that the strenuous element of the Bantu was derived from tribes of Israel, which were first carried away to Babylon, as related in the scriptures, and who afterward, in whole or in part, migrated through Egypt and to Equatorial Africa, and through mingling with native tribes upon whom they imposed much of their own religion and customs, gave rise to the peoples now known as Bantu.
So the Bantu people are Israelites. Let's go into the Bible to further prove that point. This is the book of Luke, chapter 21 and verse 20. And when he shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. When did this happen? During 70 AD with Titus and Vespasian, when they came and besieged Jerusalem and destroyed it. Verse 21, then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains. What mountains is the Bible referring to that those Israelites, the so-called Bantus, fled into? Watch this. The book of Matthew, chapter 2 and verse 13. And when they were departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, arise, take the young child and his mother, and flee into Egypt. All right, they fled into Egypt. Where's Egypt located? Africa. This is how the Israelites ended up in Africa. They fled to the mountains, and there they built great empires. They became a great nation within Africa. So now, let's go back to this article to further prove that the Afro-Indonesians are the Israelites that the Bible speaks of.
The establishment of the Dutch East India Company in the early 17th century resulted in a quick increase in volume of the slave trade in the region. There were perhaps up to 500,000 slaves in various Dutch colonies during the 17th and 18th centuries in the Indian Ocean. For example, some 4,000 African slaves were used to build the Colombo Fortress in Dutch Ceylon. Bali and neighboring islands supplied regional networks with 100,000 to 150,000 slaves during 1620 to 1830. Indian and Chinese slave traders supplied Dutch Indonesia with perhaps 250,000 slaves during the 17th and 18th centuries.
So 250,000 slaves were transported on slave ships to Indonesia, okay? Let's read the Bible to further prove that point. Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 68. And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, by the way whereof I spake unto thee. Thou shalt see it no more again. And there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. Origins of African slaves. So-called African slaves in Indonesia were primarily brought from Portuguese-controlled areas like Madagascar, Mozambique, and Angola, or through the Dutch-controlled territories in West Africa. Some Africans were captured in raids or through trade agreements with local rulers that were of Nilotic descent. Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 64. And the Lord shall scatter thee among all people, from the one end of the earth even unto the other. And there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. So many people know about the transatlantic slave trade, but you rarely hear anyone talk about the midway point that connects the transatlantic slave trade with the Indian Ocean slave trade. Watch this.
The Indian Ocean slave trade linked into the Atlantic slave trade with Cape Town as the halfway station. Where did the Cape slaves come from? 32,500 slaves came from Africa and Madagascar. 19,000 slaves came from India, and 11,500 slaves came from the Indonesian island.
So slaves were taken from Africa and sold to the Indonesian islands. Many of those same slaves were taken back to Africa and sold all throughout the earth. Let's read the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 32, verse 26. I said, I will scatter them into corners. I will make the remembrance of them to cease from among men. Role in the workforce. So-called African slaves in Indonesia were used for various purposes, including working on spice plantations, mining operations, domestic service, and in some cases as soldiers in the colonial army. They were an important part of the labor force that enabled the Dutch to maintain their profitable colonial activities.
Belanda Hitam, Indonesian for Black Dutchman, was an Indonesian language term used to refer to black soldiers recruited by the Dutch colonial empire for service in the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, or NIL, the colonial army of the Dutch East Indies. Between 1831 and 1872, over 3,000 West Africans, mostly Akan people, were recruited from the Dutch Gold Coast for NIL service in the East Indies.
So let's read the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 28, verse 48. Therefore shalt thou serve thine enemies, which the Lord shall send against thee, in hunger, and in thirst, and in nakedness, and in want of all things. And he shall put a yoke of iron upon thy neck until he have destroyed thee. African slaves in urban areas. Some so-called African slaves were brought to urban centers like Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, where they worked in domestic service, in the military, or on ships. The population of enslaved so-called Africans in these areas was significant enough to create communities that had distinct cultural identities. Deuteronomy chapter 14 and verse 2. For thou art an holy people unto the Lord thy God. The Lord thy God hath chosen thee to be a peculiar people unto himself, above all nations that are upon the earth. Decline and aftermath. The abolition of slavery in the Dutch colonies in the 19th century led to the gradual end of African slave trade in Indonesia. However, the legacy of African slavery shows in certain cultural and historical traces, particularly within Afro-Indonesian communities today, who maintain unique traditions and identities. This is the book of Hosea, chapter 1 and verse 10. Yet the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured nor numbered. And it shall come to pass that in the place where it was said unto them, Ye are not my people, there it shall be said unto them, Ye are the sons of the living God. While slavery in Indonesia was not as massive or as publicized as other regions, the fact still remains the same. Our brothers and sisters that scattered in Indonesia, you are the Israelites according to the Bible.